welcome Father Edward Mazik, the rector of St. Vincent Seminary and a member of the St. Vincent Benedictine community. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our annual Pope Benedict XVI lecture, given this year by Dr. Philip Jenkins, a distinguished scholar whom we are delighted to welcome back once again to our St. Vincent campus, together with his wife Elizabeth, who joins us this evening. Before I introduce Dr. Jenkins, first a word about the Pope Benedict XVI lecture series. This series was established through the generosity of Mrs. Rodora Donahue and her late husband, John Donahue, and through the generosity of the late Dr. and Mrs. George McGovern, Sr. I extend my sincere thanks to Mrs. Donahue and to her entire family, and to the family of Dr. and Mrs. McGovern for their continued support of the Pope Benedict XVI lecture series. I extend my thanks as well to Archabbot Douglas Nowicki, here present this evening, the Chancellor of St. Vincent Seminary and St. Vincent College, for his key role in establishing and supporting the Pope Benedict XVI lecture series. I also am deeply grateful to Father Boniface Hicks, the director of the Institute for Ministry Formation at St. Vincent Seminary, and to Dr. Margaret Watkins, the Dean of the School of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences of St. Vincent College, for co-sponsoring this evening's event. Friends, the first Pope Benedict XVI lecture was given in November of 2005 by Dr. Scott Hahn, and it was on the subject of biblical interpretation in the modern day. Since then, a broad range of speakers have engaged with the St. Vincent community on topics of contemporary interest in the areas of theology, history, philosophy, artistic culture, and the intersection between faith and public life, and between faith and science. Tonight's lecture by Dr. Philip Jenkins continues that rich tradition of intellectual exploration of faith and reason, and it is entitled, "The Church in the 21st Century, Is the Church Entering a New Golden Age or a New Dark Age?" Dr. Jenkins was educated at the University of Cambridge, where he received his doctorate in history. From 1980 until 2011, Dr. Jenkins taught at Penn State University, where he currently holds the rank of Emeritus Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of Humanities. In 2012, he also became a distinguished professor of history at Baylor University in Texas. Dr. Jenkins has published 29 books, which have been translated into 16 languages. His most recent titles include The Many Faces of Christ, the 1,000-year story of the survival and influence of the lost Gospels, Crucible of Faith, the ancient revolution that made our modern religious world, and most recently, Rethinking a Nation, the United States in the 21st Century. My friends, please join with me in welcoming to St. Vincent, Dr. Philip Jenkins.
Thank you very much. This is by no means my first visit to St. Vincent. It's a place I love dearly. It's a place I feel very much at home, and it's a great delight to be back here. This is a very special place for me. One problem with titling this the Benedict the 16th lecture is that Pope Benedict set such incredibly high intellectual standards, set such a high bar, that it's almost impossible for any speaker to come up to them. I'm not going to try. But what I am going to do is I'm going to talk of themes that are and have been of prime interest to him, both in terms of history and globalization. And so in that sense, I think I'm speaking in his tradition, if not at his level. Bear with me. So is the church entering a new dark age or a new golden age? Is this the best of times? Is it the worst of times? And I can answer very clearly a definite yes. I can argue definitely for both positions. And if you think of the history of Christianity, there's no reason why not. Because very often through that history, a glorious dawn in one part of the world has coincided with a midnight, with a terrible time of darkness in another part of the world. Those things happen together. We're living in such a time right now. At first sight, you look at the Christian church generally, the Catholic Church in particular, and I can see many reasons for depression, many reasons for alarm. You know, some years ago, the American Physics Society, don't ask me why the American Physics Society, presented a series of surveys looking at the countries that they projected by the end of the present century would be entirely without religion. And they came up with a list of 10 countries that would be entirely godless by 2100. And here's the list. So it starts off with a catalogue of the British Empire. It starts off with Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And all the other countries are European. And those countries would include Ireland, the Netherlands, Austria, Switzerland, the Czech Republic, Estonia, and I know I'm missing one, but I think that's a fairly substantial statement in its own right. You don't have to agree with that or accept that entirely, but let's think about it. 100 years ago, if you were awarding prizes for the most religious countries on the planet, Ireland and Austria would definitely be very high on the list, and they're projected to be godless. What is happening? If you look at the church in our own country, then I need not tell you the number of concerns, the number of worries. You know, back in 1996, I published a book about what was then a very new phenomenon, which was the crisis over clergy sexual abuse. And Father Richard Newhouse very kindly, very generously offered to write a blurb for it, but he wanted it written in a particular way. And what he said is, oh, you know, this is a very fine book, it's a very good book. Although Jenkins exaggerates the impact of the crisis he is describing, and with great respect to a man I love dearly, I think he was wrong. So there are so many reasons for concern, for alarm. But I want to do this in two parts. First of all, I want to talk about the evidence for this being a golden age, and for us entering a golden age in the story specifically of the Catholic Church. I would say that we today, whether we recognize it or not, are living in one of the greatest ever ages of Christian expansion, of Christian growth. And when you look at this, and you look at this on a global scale, it's a little hard to say, oh yeah, and the church is falling apart and dying. So, oh, by the way, I always like that quote. That's Mark Twain, and he was writing back about 1900. In this world, we've seen the Roman Catholic power dying for many centuries. Many times we've gotten all ready for the funeral, found it postponed again on account of the weather or something. Apparently, one of the most uncertain things in the world is the funeral of a religion, to which all I can say is amen to that. So let me give you some numbers, all right? Numbers are not everything, but they're not nothing. Back in 1950, there were approximately 440 million Roman Catholics. That number grew to 650 million by 1970, and to about 1.2, 1.3 billion today. The number of Catholics in the planet has doubled in the last 50 years. Tell me again about this Dark Age thing. By 2050, the projected number is 1.6 billion. Still, by that point, the Roman Catholic Church will be what it has been for a great many years, which is by far the largest religious institution on the planet, and in fact, by far the largest institution on the planet. And I can talk about that generally. So let's try and balance this. If Austria and Ireland are losing their religion, how can we have this amazing growth? And what we have to do is to look back at history and look back at the church, not just as a phenomenon of globalization, but the phenomenon that invented globalization, which is a Catholic phenomenon. In earlier eras, people drew maps for many purposes. If anyone tries to navigate by this map, I do not give much for your chances. But as a symbolic statement, it's magnificent. It's from the 16th century, and it shows the way people used to think of the world, with three leaves of Europe, Africa, and Asia. And each of them was equally valid, and Jerusalem is so important because Christ was dying at the center of the world to save the world. There were those three leaves. And by the way, this is just at the point where just in the corner, they figured out this thing called North America, and they're saying, well, we'll fit this into the system somehow. Don't entirely know how, but we'll do it somehow. When you tell the history of Christianity, you have to use that model. You have to use those three leaves. Always remember, Christianity is a faith which has expanded into Africa, into Asia, into Europe at different times. Those churches have flourished, or faded, or died. But we today are living in an age when Christianity, a religion born in Asia and Africa, has decided to go home, which it is doing in absolutely unbelievable numbers. I'll just show this, this picture, and I'll be coming back to this. This is kind of curiously appropriate. This is by Peter Paul Rubens, and this is almost exactly from 400 years ago. This is from the year 1618. Sorry, we're 1 year off here. And it represents the way the church thought of itself at that time. And this is Francis Xavier, and he's carrying out his miracles. But if you look at the characters in the painting, they are precisely detailed pictures of Chinese people, Korean people, African people, who were real people who Rubens had met in what we today would call Belgium, in Antwerp. Many of them are in correct clothes, and this is the picture of a global church. I said the church invented globalization. Let me justify that number. You've heard of great empires in the past, okay? You've heard of the Roman Empire, you've heard of the Mongol Empire, and you've probably heard of them as world empires. No, they're not world empires. They're Eurasian. The first world empires were the Iberian, the Spanish and Portuguese Catholic empires of the 16th century. I'll give you a great date for when globalization truly began, which is when 1579, when the Diocese of Manila in the Philippines was established as a suffragan see of Mexico City, and when the main route of imperial trade and mission was the route that ran from Manila to Acapulco. And if you look at that story, which basically is a 300-year story, you are looking at the great missionary era. There is a great and definitive Catholic missionary era before what Protestants call the Great Missionary Century, which is the 19th century. Why am I talking about this in the context of the church in the 21st century? Because the seeds that were planted in that era are the ones that have come to full fruition in our own time. What are the three largest Catholic populations in the world? They're all the remnants of those empires: Brazil, Mexico, and the Philippines. And all those countries in numbers, in Catholic numbers, are growing very rapidly. Since partly that's demographic. In 1970, there were about 50 million Mexicans. Today, there are about 120 million Mexicans. That means vastly more Mexican Catholics. By 2050, there will be at least 100 million Philippine Catholics. And those countries, those new Catholic countries, new since the 16th century, have vastly outpaced their European originals. Last year, figure I always enjoy, there were more Catholic baptisms in the Philippines than in France, Spain, Poland, and Ireland combined. The future looks to the south, and we are living in a spectacular time of this expansion. But there's a still larger part of this story, the numbers of which are so surprisingly almost defy credibility, and that's the story of Africa, and that's the story of Catholic Africa. Let me give you some raw numbers. Back in 1900, there were approximately 2 million Catholics in the whole African continent. By 2000, those 2 million had grown to 130 million, which, oh, by the way, is the largest quantitative change that has ever occurred in religion, period, any era. And that, John Allen, great Catholic journalist and scholar and observer of the world, points out that the 20th century growth of African Catholics represented a growth of 6,700%. For those of you who have a humanities background, that's more than double. But the number did not stop at that point. Today, the number is over 200 million. And the present projection is that by 2050, the number will be 460 million. Now, to put that in context, by that point, there will be more African Catholics than there were Catholics anywhere in the world in 1950. That's an increase. That's a very substantial increase. And if you want to look at a list of the world's 10 largest Catholic countries, as it changes between, say, 2000 and 2050, then you'll notice one thing changing very definitely, which is European countries drop out one by one and are replaced by mainly African countries, by Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. And, you know, you can complete this sentence in many different ways, but the greatest problem facing the Catholic Church is that the Vatican is located 2,000 miles too far north, because it's nowhere near the center of the Catholic world. You might get that impression from the distribution of cardinals. Italy, 4% of Catholics, 20% of cardinals. An effort, by the way, that Pope Benedict made heroic efforts to counter and to correct. But the situation is really changing too fast, almost to be seen. So if I'm standing from the point of view of Dublin, maybe I'm seeing a Catholic dark age. if I'm standing from the point of view of the Igbo people in Nigeria, a dark age? Well, yes, I mean, certainly there are problems. I mean, we can't build seminaries enough for all the people who want to get in. We have problems. But don't tell me about a dark age. Oh, these figures, by the way, are totally wrong in one way. And let me tell you why. Well, two ways. First of all, there is strong evidence that all the figures you see for Catholic Africa are understated. And I'll tell you why. At Baylor, we have some data which ask people about their religious identification, okay? And then you compare that to official church statistics, and what we're finding systematically is that in most parts of Africa, Catholics are undercounting by about 20%. In other words, there are way more people who define themselves as Catholic, think they're Catholic, but the local dioceses haven't picked up on them because they're too busy baptizing people to count properly. I'm semi-serious about that one. The other one is when I talk about a distribution of people by continent, don't forget migration. Don't forget the number of people from the global south in the global north, a number which is changing all the time. So when you look at the impact of Catholicism in Africa, please remember all those Africans in Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Latinos in the United States. The global south is in the north. This was brought home to me a few years ago. We were visiting Denmark, which, it doesn't actually say this in its tourist information, but maybe the world's least Catholic country, where there's virtually no Catholic presence and has not been for centuries, basically since the Reformation, until very recently. And so we were in a city called Aarhus, which is a prominent city in Denmark, big university city. And there's a tiny, tiny little Catholic church, and you can't drive down the street at many parts of the day. Why? Because all the worshippers are flowing out into the streets. And you think, well, this is strange. The Danes are having a religious revival? Surely not. And then you look at the signs of the masses, which are in, let me get this right, English, of course, somebody has to serve the Africans, English, Vietnamese, Tagalog, which is the Philippine language, Polish, and Chaldean for the Iraqi Christians. And so they operate a tightly run shift system of masses when the Vietnamese have to be cleared out so the Chaldeans can be brought in. But if you want to see the immigrant Catholic presence in Europe, look at something like that. If I look at the larger church, not beyond Catholics, the story is amazing. The four largest mega churches in Britain, and yes, there are mega churches in Britain, are all pastored by Africans, virtually always Nigerians. In the Francophone countries, in France and Belgium, they're virtually always pastored by Congolese. And you get a somewhat similar pattern if you look at many seminaries in Europe, where you get so many African or Vietnamese candidates and new priests. In fact, the more you look at the European Catholic Church, the more it looks like a missionary church. The more it looks like a church that is staffed by priests and clergy from another continent. And if you've ever wondered about the statement of the empires strike back, the empires have struck back, seriously. And often these newer churches, they're very helpful. There's a London evangelist called Matthew Ashimolowo, who's a very controversial figure in lots of ways, but he made an eminently useful suggestion to the Church of England. He pointed out that they had lots of buildings but no worshippers. He had lots of worshippers but no buildings. Could he please have some of their buildings? As yet, no answer has been received. I'm not going to blaze through all these different tables and things, but just to give you an idea, This is looking at where Catholics were in 1910 and 2010. And there's absolutely no doubt, you know, when you look at 1910, overwhelmingly you're talking about a European phenomenon. And by the time you look at 2010, Africans have gone from well under 1% to about 16%. It's more now. It's a very dramatic story. One reason why this is important, partly it's a demographic story, okay? More people, higher fertility rates, and so on, but it is also conversions on a very large scale. In 1900, Christians, not just Catholics, made up 10% of the African population. Today that number is about 50%. And again, sorry to say this again, that is the largest change of its kind ever recorded in the history of religion. So we're dealing with historic times. This is kind of an interesting view of the Catholic world. And everyone might be familiar with the importance of Latin America, yes, and Europe, but note the numbers in those African countries. If you want to see a large part of the Catholic future and Catholic growth, look at those areas. And you know, we're already seeing an impact of that in the role played by some African prelates in some of the discussions that have been so often quite divisive in the papacy of Pope Francis. We had the Synod of the Family a few years ago. Very interesting series of clashes between more liberal European prelates and really very, very conservative African prelates. Issues like that are going to arise more and more. And Catholics could usefully spend a great deal of time looking at the experience of other churches, like the Anglican Communion and so on. Lutherans, they're a long, long way away from that yet, but there are certainly lessons to be learned. Note I haven't said much about Latin America as yet. Latin America, you're talking about very large numbers. As a proportion of Catholics, it hasn't changed that much. What is the real monster change, as I say, is Africa. And there are other communities. The church is not large as a proportion of the people of India or China, but the actual numbers are very substantial. You know, sometimes when I talk about this, I like to talk about a prophecy which is very rare because it is a prophecy that is empirically verifiable. And I sometimes look back at the year 1640, which was probably the worst year in European history. Until 1940, Protestants killing Catholics, Catholics killing Protestants, Christians killing Jews. And at that time, there was a man called St. Vincent de Paul. And St. Vincent de Paul made a very interesting comment. He said back in 1640, Christ said his church would last until the end of time. He never mentioned the word Europe. The church of the future, he said in 1640, will be the church of China, of Japan, of South America, and of Africa. Well, we can quibble about Japan. Japan did produce probably the greatest Catholic novelist of the last 100 years, Shusaku Endo. Discuss. But otherwise, that was a prophecy. And it's very verifiable. So, as I say, when you look at the Catholic Church, let me make one request here. When you talk about Catholics today believe, or Catholics today think, or what Catholics are today, always bear in mind there is this large kind of rest of the planet, and statements that might be true of the United States often are not true in the world where Catholicism is spreading. What's a good theological term? Oh yeah, like crabgrass. it's a very different world. That also affects maybe how we think about Catholic history, how we write Catholic history. Nothing would be more wrong than to say that, throughout its history, the church is like a European, Mediterranean thing, and then in modern times it spreads out and becomes this great global phenomenon. Always remember that some of the oldest and most important churches of the world are found in Africa and Asia. They suffered in many ways. They were cut off from the rest of the world, but they survived, and they survived in remarkable numbers. That is what an Ethiopian priest looks like in a church that was Christian 10 generations before Christianity spread to the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. If you ever meet a South Indian Christian, take a friendly word of advice. Do not ask them what missionaries converted them. They will tell you, well, we think it was Thomas, but my wife there thinks it was Paul. They will tell you. Also, get used to Catholicism being a very different thing in some of these other areas than it might be in those areas that are Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. Those areas that are W-E-I-R-D, weird. In the rest of the world, the issues that are under discussion are often those that would have made wonderful sense in the early church. Issues of spiritual warfare, issues of prophecy, issues that the rest of the church dealt with a long time ago. I can illustrate this with a great many stories, but one I find kind of interesting. True story. I want you to imagine a church in Uganda, in Central Africa. I want you to imagine a church that, like most churches in that particular area, has got far, far, far more people trying to get in than can possibly get in. And I want you to imagine a special service that has been held. And at that special service, many people report healing, which is one of the basic functions of the church in its ancient and modern manifestations. So a man puts his hand up and wants to report that a spinal complaint he suffered for many years has been healed. Well, this is wonderful. A woman raises her hand and wants to report another kind of healing. This is wonderful. And eventually the deacon starts kind of looking at his watch and says, we'd like to get out of here before next Sunday. All right, put your hands down. Anyone who wants to report being healed of this kind of ailment, raise your hands now. Okay, this kind of ailment, right. What sort of church was this? Obviously it's a Roman Catholic church. And the special service was the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament. Do you get the idea that Catholicism is a broader range of practices and beliefs today than it has been in a millennium? So you live in a time of growth. You live in a time of spiritual fervor and excitement and a sense that the church and the faith are transforming the world. And people say it's a dark age. Show me a golden age, please. So we live in a very remarkable time. Oh, and you can make all sorts of comments about how Christianity is operating. You make a lot of doubts about this. So, if you have services that are drawing in these vast numbers of people to miracle crusades and so on, how authentic is the experience? Miracle revivals and so on. There's one picture I'm going to put up. I don't defend every aspect of it, but it's the way in which many people present the scene as it is in Britain between the two different kinds of church. There are the ones that are very, what do you call them, charismatic. And there are the ones that are very masterpiece theatre. polite and staid and declining. And when you look at the charismatic or Pentecostal experience, you learn a lot. And it makes me wonder, if for instance, anyone knows of a seminary within 100 miles of here, how far do seminaries go to things like healing? Because if you're interested in the church as it is in the areas where it's expanding like crabgrass, healing is a main bit of what it does. And the study of the work of the Spirit, of pneumatology, very, very central to the Catholic tradition, very central to the Orthodox tradition, but a theme that often goes underground and is often forgotten. And I can point to good sides of this, megachurch, where 2,000 or 3,000 come together in my name. And before anyone says, yeah, but there's a downside of this, and I'm saying, yeah, of course there is. And you have some people who would criticize the prosperity gospel, and that's absolutely legitimate. And by the way, that's if this is not your third car, you are not in God's will. And I can put a side against prosperity, and I can make an argument for prosperity. You'd be surprised how many prosperity churches in Africa teach lessons that are geared for very backward people. Like they will say, now you want to be very careful. The people will try and give you credit and credit cards. You can run into terrible debt. Save up. Be thrifty. Now, these lessons are not at all relevant to Americans, but to primitive people. You see my point. This is good advice. You want to be prosperous? Here's a practical way to do it. Okay, that's my golden age argument. If that's true, so what's happening in other countries? I'm going to change tone a little bit here. I want to talk about another set of religious trends that are in the world that are immensely influential for the United States and for Europe. Bear with me, I'm going to give you some numbers and some statistics. You may want to hold the hand of the person next to you. We'll get through this very, very painlessly. There is a close relationship between the level of religion in a society and the fertility rate in that society, the number of children that a woman has in her lifetime. If that number is about 2.1, we call that replacement rate. Society jogs on, same sort of numbers. If that number is much higher, say it's 5 or 6 per woman, it's a very young, expanding population. If it's way below 2.1, it's a contracting, aging population. Okay, that's the most painful bit over with. Now let me explain. Why am I mentioning this? If you look around the world today, the most important trend, maybe apart from climate change, is the collapse in fertility rates worldwide. Around the world, not originally in Europe, the fertility rate is falling to around 1.7, 1.6, and what that means is an aging, shrinking, and less religious society. Imagine a society where you take children out of the equation. People are no longer tied to churches or religious institutions by having their kids in religious training, in church schools, whatever. They become more and more detached from those institutions. We originally saw that in Scandinavian countries like Denmark, and then that spread around the world. The reason I'm mentioning this is that Europe has now got some of the lowest fertility rates in the world and has some of the most secular societies in the world. And I'm arguing in my latest book that that's a direct link. The two go down together. And I'll give you an example of that. If you want to see the Dark Age argument in progress, let's look at Belgium. Do you remember Belgium was the country that produced Rubens with that wonderful painting earlier? 100 years ago, Belgium was probably the most Catholic country in the world. It was up there with Ireland. In the First World War, the leading cardinal of Belgium was kind of the great national hero. If you weren't Catholic, then you weren't a loyal Belgian. It was absolutely central. They produced amazing numbers of vocations. It was a remarkable country. In the 1970s and 80s, the fertility rate collapsed, people stopped having children, and people stopped going to church. And Belgium became a country that rapidly became one of the world's most secular countries over the space of 25 years. And that should be a warning to people in many other countries. How secular is it? Last year was unusual. They got the number of vocations in the whole country up to 2. That was progress. Brussels is currently closing half its parish churches. In terms of civil law, the government legalized, abortion in 1990. It became the second country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage in 2003. They legalized euthanasia in 2002 and euthanasia for children in 2014. In every one of these incidents, the Catholic Church raged and screamed and protested and was totally ignored. And were told, this is a secular country. You know, people sometimes talk about a particular argument and they say, this is a slippery slope. We're going to end up going down the slippery slope. Where do you go below that? Where does the church go? Is that not close to extinction of church influence? The proportion of Belgians who define themselves as Christian is around 50% presently. But as I say, it is falling so fast. And you might say, does Belgium matter? Belgium has become the bellwether pattern for most of Catholic Europe. That is the pattern probably that Ireland has begun in the last 5 to 10 years. If you look across Europe, you see a number of referenda and debates over issues like abortion, euthanasia, same-sex marriage, and in every one of those there has been an increasingly catastrophic defeat for the Catholic Church. The Church loses public influence, it loses membership, it's a vicious circle. And if somebody says that Ireland will be a country without religion in another 80 years, I'd say maybe. No, I'd actually make a couple of exceptions to that. It'll be a different religion. Because a country with a very low fertility rate can only survive by bringing in people to pay taxes and to do the jobs. They bring in poor people, and those poor people usually have their own religion. They are Muslim in some countries, and they're Christian in others. But they're a different kind of Christian. They are African or Asian or Latin American Christian. Go to Italy, for instance, a country with an incredibly low fertility rate, and look at the Filipino population of Rome, which is enormous. Oh, you know, I said this is a very important topic, and your view might be, well, you know, this is about Europe. I'm not going to Europe. It doesn't affect me. That is now spreading worldwide. You know what it's spreading to? It's spreading to South America, where countries like Uruguay and Mexico and Brazil now have some of the lowest fertility rates in the world, and almost certainly in a generation that is going to be reflected in a major drift to secularization. Brazil presently, secular or nuns, N-O-N-E, not N-U-N, N-O-N-Es, people who have no religious affiliation, are now a third religious group alongside evangelicals and Catholics. And the difference is they are growing and the others are not. You see it across Asia, and I'll just say this, though it doesn't directly bear on the topic of my talk, but it's kind of interesting. You know what the areas are in the world with the sharpest falling fertility and very likely to become most secular in the very near future are all Islamic countries. Iran in the 1980s, a typical woman had 7 children. A typical Iranian woman today has 1.6, which is below Denmark. If other precedents mean anything, Iran is going to be a very, very secular country anytime soon. A bunch of clergy in the government are going to say, we're going to fight a great jihad, and the country will respond as a bunch of 40-year-old guys saying, no, we're playing video games. We really can't be bothered. The information's hard to get, but the Iranian Revolutionary Guard says that there are 60,000 mosques in the country, of which 3,000 are operating. I could, as they say, talk about this at great length. But just to give you one example, does anyone remember back in the 60s and 70s, people used to talk about the population explosion, and people used to write about the population bomb, and people always used to use the example of India. Half the states of India now have fertility rates below Denmark, and the other half are a little bit higher, but not much. Does this affect us? Does this affect you? Oh yes, for this reason. For 25 years, various defensive and desperate people have said, aha, the United States is an advanced society, it's an educated society, but it is resisting secularization, and the proof of that is it still has a really high fertility rate. And these poor deluded people, hello, made this argument, and just in the last 5 years we are totally wrong. Just in the last 5 years, the US fertility rate has gone to Denmark, below Denmark. It is virtually certain that secular trends are going to follow very quickly, and the best evidence you're going to see of that is in the proportion of Americans who define themselves as none. Many of you may have seen a report in the press last week. The Pew Foundation did a very good bit of research that basically asked people, what's your religious allegiance? The proportion of Catholics in the last 15 years has gone from 26% to 20%. That's a big drop. And that's making allowance for all the Latinos who come into the country and so on. The proportion of nuns in that same time has gone from 15% to 27%. And if you ask young people, people below the age of 29, the proportion of nuns is up to 40%. Those nuns are growing very rapidly. Now, let me emphasize here, nuns does not mean no religion. It means that they're refusing to identify with any religious tradition. Are you a Protestant? Are you a Catholic? Are you a Christian? No. And then you go to them and say, well, what do you do? Well, I pray, I go to church, I read the Bible. America has the most religious nuns on the planet. So if anyone ever tells you it's atheists, no, they're not. Atheists are different. Atheists, by the way, it's a great story in the United States. In 1900, the number of atheists in the US was about 4.5% of the population. By 1980, it was about 4.5% of the population. You know what it is now, altogether now? 4.5%. Right, good. But nuns, people who reject an affiliation with churches or religious groups, are growing fast. That is not yet secularization, but that's amazing change for about a decade. And I think that's something that, unless people pay attention to that, that is going to grow and result in real serious secularization. I think I know what's happening. Okay, this is hypothesis. Partly it's people who are asked, are you evangelical? Would say evangelical. No, that's associated with these images of conservatism and racism and all these terrible ideas in 2016 election. No, I'm not evangelical. I'm none. Or Catholics, who 20 years ago would have said, yeah, I'm Catholic, but now think, I look at the scandals in the church, I look at the things I don't agree with, I think of the abuse cases. I'm not going to call myself Catholic anymore. I still do a lot of Catholic things, but I'm rejecting the label. But my suggestion is, when you reject the label, you're well on the way to a European kind of secularization. So I would make the argument that America presently is still, by far, the most religious of any advanced country. Its Catholics are the most numerous and powerful and expansive of any advanced country. But the signs of trouble are there. If you like, as Jefferson said in a different context, the fire bell in the night is ringing. If you want to call that a dark age, then you can. So if I was projecting the world in another 30 or 40 years, I can tell you certain things. I can tell you that there are countries that are going to be extremely religious, and those countries are going to be in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in India, in China, to some extent in South America. But I really seriously worry about Europe, except where Christianity is reintroduced as a missionary religion or a fresh plant or an immigrant faith. And if I was giving this lecture 10 years ago, I would have said that, but now I would say, and the United States. One of the most interesting and alarming trends I've seen in recent surveys is the proportion of Latinos who have moved from being Catholic to none in the last 10 years. And that's disturbing. What do you do about this? Well, let me go back to Pope Benedict again. He actually paid very serious attention to this. And what he said is, look, the mass church, the church where everyone is assumed to go to Mass on a Sunday, it's a wonderful thing, it's a beautiful thing, but it's not our only way of being church. We have to think ourselves back to the early centuries when Christians were a creative minority. They were the leaven, they were the yeast in the bread. And how he defined that leaven, that yeast in the modern world, was through things like new ecclesial movements, through movements of small, very highly committed groups, highly committed believers, and they are the ones who are the, if you like, the active ingredients in the church. And that doesn't mean a kind of second-class citizenship for other people, but it's a strategy for addressing that larger problem. You know, just to give you an example, how do you address a world that has moved so far to secularism? You have to think about that. In Britain, one of the great examples is the, I don't know if you're familiar with this, the Alpha Course, which emerged from this very charismatic Anglican megachurch, which is based on a society where likely you're dealing with couples or singles, they don't have children, you talk to they're not in the same school, they may not be in the same workplace long, you talk to them as individuals, you network with them, you invite them to dinner, you take them through this program that leads to a commitment to Christ. I believe it was the Archbishop of Paris who said that the Alpha Course is the greatest gift of Protestantism to the Catholic Church since Pentecostalism. Discuss. Wouldn't that be a great exam question? So maybe what you have to do is rethink from trying to recreate the world of 1950 and try and create the world of 350 in terms of the position of the church. Just wind up by saying two things. First of all, the Catholic Church is very good at dark ages. It's done them before. A novel I swear by, and if you have not read it, then cancel all other plans until you have, is a science fiction book that appeared in 1960 by Walter Miller called A Canticle for Leibowitz, which is a science fiction story that imagines a post-nuclear world where civilization and learning and science are preserved in Benedictine, happy to tell you, abbeys, and it traces the rise and subsequent collapse of civilization. But in all those worlds, the church is central in coping with, surviving through the Dark Age. What was the world that Benedict lived in? Was it not a world of a Christian minority and a creative minority? To wind up, I'd just like to read you one passage. If you know this, bear with me. It's a good one. Back in 1840, the German historian von Ranke wrote a history of the popes. And the English scholar Macaulay reviewed it. And you think, okay, it's a Protestant reviewing a history of the popes in 1840. It's a very anti-Catholic world. What sort of hatred is he going to pour forth? And he began by saying, the first thing you need to know is the Catholic Church is the most important and most interesting institution on the planet. Okay? And the reason it is because it has survived anything that can be thrown at it. And he came up with a number of reasons for this. And above all, he said, because Catholics were great at handling dissent. Because they were great at taking dissenters and absorbing them into their home. But he ended with a much quoted phrase, and if I had put on my right glasses, this would be much easier, but bear with me. Okay, it talks about, look at the Catholic Church in the modern world. The Catholic Church has lost some in Europe, so what? It's conquering South America. Nor do we see any sign which indicates that the term of her long dominion is approaching. She saw the commencement of all the governments and all the ecclesiastical establishments that now exist in the world. We feel no assurance that she is not destined to see the end of them all. She was great and respected before the Saxon had set foot in Britain, before the Frank had passed the Rhine, when Grecian eloquence still flourished at Antioch, when idols were still worshipped in the temple of Mecca. And she may still exist in undiminished splendor, when some traveler from New Zealand shall, in the midst of a vast solitude, take his stand on a broken arch of London Bridge to sketch the ruins of St. Paul's. The Roman Empire falls. The Holy Roman Empire falls. Napoleon's empire falls. The British Empire falls. That could never happen. The American Empire, oh, well, we won't go there. But at the end of all of them, there's one man, well, no, one church left standing. It survives golden ages, it survives dark ages, and it's very good at very good at both. So if I was talking about the church in the 21st century, I can guarantee that at some point towards the end of the century, somebody will be standing here talking about the catastrophe about to face the Catholic Church again and how they're going into a new dark age. And someone else is going to say, no, look what's happening in, fill in the blank. Do I feel optimistic about this? I think so, evidently. Is the golden age, is it a dark age? Yes. But I think that's a part of a long pattern of optimism. Thank you very much. You've raised an absolutely critical issue in this whole story. And here's the problem. Vocations in Africa, in Asia, are booming. They're doing very, very well. The problem is that we have a structure in the larger world where many of those priests are being brought over to serve parishes in France and Italy and the United States or Britain, where they do a wonderful job. But that, by definition, weakens growth at home. And I have suggested that that's either, in the optimistic view, a really bad policy, or in the pessimistic view, a recipe for suicide. And the distribution of priests between global north and global south is now enormous. Brazil has, I think, is it 1/4 or 1/5 the number of priests per head of population as the United States? You know, think what that means. Imagine if you lost 80% of your priests here. And solving that imbalance. What some people have suggested is what needs to be done is that instead of importing African and Latin American priests to the global north, European and American priests should be sent to the global south. A lot of vocations, there are a lot of priests, but would not those priests be better building the church in the Philippines? And by the way, the Philippines is a great example. The Philippines is one of the countries that has preserved Catholic numbers from Pentecostal incursions by using ecclesial orders, ecclesial societies that are very Pentecostal in look, charismatic in look, and which are these global orders. But no, it's an absolutely key question, the distribution of priests. That has been a huge issue that was raised at the Amazon Synod, which is in progress presently. And some Latin Americans have said, you know, look, this is the elephant in the room. This is what people aren't talking about. Why are you in the north taking our priests when we should be building the church down here? Critical. I don't find that if you like, a major variable. One of the big lessons that the church did learn in Africa, for instance, in the last 50 years, was originally they tried to enculturate a lot. They tried to go into local languages, absorb local customs. There's a lot to be said for that, but ordinary people seem to like very standard standard services in standard languages. One of the big reasons, by the way, if you ever look at like miracle crusades, they're all in English. They're not in local languages. One thing that I do admire enormously is there's much more openness to African customs in terms of movement, in terms of dance, in terms of drums, in terms of music. And the debate how far that enculturation can go or should go has been very divisive in churches through the decades. So very important issue, but that's not, in my view, if you like, the central fact for growth. In a sense, if you're like an Igbo Christian in Nigeria, the church has already become so much part of your landscape. It's your church. They've done enculturation. We're here, and but if you see some of these, the thing that would strike you, I think, would be the amount of movement, the amount of excitement, and also the emphasis on things like people pay very, very serious attention to things like healing, and some other, theological ideas, spiritual warfare ideas, which would be considered embarrassing in a mainstream Catholic context in this country. Every major new religious movement or revolution, the great tectonic changes, has coincided with a change in medium. Christianity coincided with a shift from the scroll to the codex, the book, where you could turn to particular pages. You mention Gutenberg, and you mention with the idea of the origins of Protestantism. By the way, the first ever printed work, woodblock printed work, was Chinese, and it was associated with the spread of Mahayana Buddhism. Media and new religions go together. Where I've seen that in the last 30 or 40 years is in a couple of things. One, interestingly, is a technology that now sounds very dated, which is DVDs. If you look in anywhere in Africa, one of the commonest means of circulating the faith is these Nigerian religion-based DVDs. And they might tell like a Christian story. They might tell the story of a family obsessed by demons until a preacher kicks them out, and so on. These are enormously influential. If you go to a Nigerian store in Pittsburgh, you will see a ton of these. Houston, by the way, is the Nigerian capital of the United States, and there are these stores absolutely everywhere. Cable TV had a big role, satellite TV. So some of the big London mega churches, for instance, would have services simultaneously broadcast in 20 African countries. You want to talk about remote campuses. Those are remote campuses. That's Ghana. So that kind of technology. Pretty much every religious organization has its website, including some that, I thought they died out in 1740. But those are the ones that have been really useful as cable TV, satellite TV, and DVDs. Somebody should write a great book on the Jesus video. I don't think anyone's... Do people know what I mean when I'm talking about the Jesus video? Okay, back in 1979, British TV produced this Jesus film, which is, it's not great drama, but it's a good, faithful version of the story of Jesus. In the 80s and 90s, American evangelicals circulated, they claim, upwards of 20 million copies of this worldwide, videotapes, DVDs. They would go to a village. May we show you this DVD of your Muslim prophet Jesus? Yeah, oh, this is really interesting. We don't have electricity. My friend here will ride a bike to generate electricity until you've got enough for your DVD. And they claim that's the most successful evangelistic tool in history. It's a brilliant use of technology. And interestingly, I'm also interested how many people don't know it's there. So different kinds of new technology, yes. The big absence in terms of your question is internet-based technologies. And I'm not seeing those particularly as yet. All these groups have got websites, sure. You can follow these services, you can watch these services, etc. But it's not a kind of creative, imaginative use of the internet yet. Maybe soon. Maybe soon. Oh, one other interesting thing. All these Christian innovations have been very widely imitated by Muslims trying to keep up. So there are Muslim televangelists. Seriously. There are Muslims who've adopted Pentecostal worship styles in Africa to compete. It's a long story. Let me see. In terms of peace around the world, I can point to many cases where the church has brought societies together, and some where it very palpably has not. In Sri Lanka, for instance, which had this extremely violent series of wars over the last 30 years, I'd love to tell the story of how the church brought reconciliation and tried to bring enemies together, and some tried, and others were offsetting bombs. So it's kind of a mixed picture. There are also enough wars going on in the world and enough people dying that I'm a little bit cautious about that. I will give you one statistic which really upsets me, and I hope it upsets you. If you look at Africa over the last 30 years, there is a direct and reliable correlation between the proportion of a country's population that is Christian and the proportion of that people who have been killed in civil wars. Let me say that again. The most Christian countries have also been the ones that have had the most bloody civil wars. The great example being Rwanda, with the genocide then. So what I'd say is it's a mixed picture. The really embarrassing moment in Rwanda was when they had the great massacres in 1994. If you're a member of the minority tribe that was being massacred, the worst thing you could do was flee to a church, because the church would turn you in and kill you. But what you did do, if you were a Christian, was you fled to the Muslims. And what they said was, don't worry, brother, our God knows nothing of tribes. That's a very good question about the idea of this moralistic therapeutic deism. The idea is it's a group of, let me be rude, sort of feel-good approaches and so on. What's been most interesting in Europe has been not the rise of some kind of parallel to that, but it's altogether religion being taken off the agenda. So if you're in a country like the Netherlands, for instance, they no longer really ask about religion because they assume it's not there. People don't bother to be atheists. In other words, because atheism is a positive statement about God. You know, G.K. Chesterton once made an argument. It's a great phrase. He said, "Atheism assumes faith. And if you don't believe me, try thinking a hostile or nasty thought about the god Thor." No, I can't do it either because I don't vaguely believe in Thor. And that's the situation in Europe. People aren't even atheist anymore. Why would I be atheist? I'm not a believer. God has nothing to do with me. So moral therapeutic deism is more religious than they want to be. Seriously, some of the surveys among young people in Europe in the last 10 years have been just incredible in that way. You no longer have some kind of residual religion as a default faith. It's just off the agenda. And where that's most striking is in countries like Ireland. Ireland that used to be Catholic, in case anyone doesn't know. So it's a different world. I come back to Pope Benedict's remark about coping with a church where so many people are sort of indifferent, and the idea is that you have these movements like renewal in the spirit, focolari, and so on, which are based on the idea of drawing the lay faithful into these groups as, if you like, an activist kind of leaven, a creative minority, as seeing the world as a missionary world, seeing Europe as a missionary world. And very often learning what they can from so many of the immigrant churches down the road. But they would be crucial to the story. These are not, clerically driven movement. And I would add one thing that's absolutely crucial about them, which is central, and a word I have not mentioned much. Women are so central in leading them. If you look at the websites of groups like the Italian Renewal in the Spirit, and look at the leaders and spokespeople, priest, woman, 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 woman. Just gets us back to the idea of how through the history of Christianity, and particularly the history of Catholicism, women kept the faith alive through those dark ages and through the next one. And boy, that's a good line to end on. I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jenkins. You have shared some truly challenging perspectives with us regarding the changing patterns of religious belief and the intersection of religion and society the world over. You give voice to both the hopes and the fears, you could say, that people of faith have these days. You also mentioned in the course of your remarks St. Vincent de Paul, the man for whom this community is named, and you mentioned St. Benedict, the person around whose rule this community has been built for some 170 years. Moved and inspired by the virtue and the wisdom and the foresight of those two saints, and inspired as well by the thoughts and the sentiments that you share with us this evening, let us all strive to build a world of greater hope and faith and charity and peace for religious believers and for all citizens of our communities, both here in this region and beyond. So please join me, friends, once more in thanking Dr. Philip Jenkins.